Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott. Over the years, I can't tell you how many times I've had requests from my audience to start to cover Nikon products. I have resisted that over the years for the primary reason that I was already heavily invested in other platforms and just didn't feel like I could add on the time. However, when Nikon opened up their Z mount finally to some third-party development, and I recognized that it wasn't just an opportunity to cover first-party Nikon products, but also to see how that some of my relationships with other third-party brands, how their products would work on Nikon Z mount, it finally kind of was the tipping point for me. And so I began to do research. If I was going to do this, what would be the best Nikon camera for what I do? And after research, I concluded that it was the Nikon Z8 that checked the most boxes for me. It is a camera that isn't brand new, it was actually released over a year ago, but they fixed some of the initial manufacturing issues that were with the camera, and then they updated the autofocus and some of the general performance via the very important Firmware 2.0. And so that happened just briefly before I decided to take the plunge. I've now used the camera for nearly 7 months. I've done 11 different lens reviews on it. And I've taken my time getting to this day because rather than just giving you another review, which there was already plenty of reviews to begin with, I wanted this to not only be a Firmware 2.0 review, but also a long-term review. And because I'm not very familiar with Nikon, in fact, I've only covered the Nikon D850 previously, I wanted to take my time to really get familiar with using a Nikon in the similar ways to all the ways that I use a camera and I want to use a camera, and so I could report back to you with some confidence. And I feel at this point that I've been able to achieve that. So, in 2024, is the Nikon Z8 worth considering? Let's dive in and find out.
Today's episode is sponsored by the Fantom Tracker. Are you someone prone to misplacing your wallet or bag? If so, the Fantom Tracker card is definitely for you. This credit card-sized tracker fits perfectly in any wallet or bag and functions like an Apple AirTag. It can be locally tracked via a 95 decibel beeping noise that can be heard up to 300 feet away, but also on a global level via Apple's Find My network and its map. Unlike many other trackers, the Fantom Tracker card has a built-in rechargeable battery that can be easily charged via any wireless charger, and a single charge will last up to 6 months. The low price of the Fantom Tracker makes it a perfect gift, and you can save even more by visiting store.fantomwallet.com and using code DUSTIN20 at checkout. That's store.fantomwallet.com and use code DUSTIN20 for 20% off.
Now, the Nikon Z8 is a jack-of-all-trades camera that in many ways is competitive with cameras I already own, like the Sony Alpha 1 in some ways, and then other cameras like the Canon EOS R5. The first thing that I noted after having used a lot of full-frame cameras for a lot of years is how big the Z8 body is. It is a full 2 pounds in weight, or 910 grams, which is a whopping 240 grams heavier than the new R5 Mark II, and it's 173 grams heavier than my Sony Alpha 1. And so this is not a small body. In fact, I noted when a few months ago I did a review of the Fujifilm GFX 100S Mark II, which is a medium format camera, that actually the Z8 is larger internally in terms of the overall volume than what that medium format camera is. And so this is really kind of stretching the limit of what a full frame camera should be, at least in the non-integrated vertical grip style. You know, you can get a larger, which has the grip built into it, like the Z9, for example. And but this, I'm not personally a big fan of vertical integrated grip style bodies, and so this was the body style I wanted, but certainly it is large. Now, to be fair, I think that while it's large, it's nicely ergonomically made. It fits nicely in my hand, and even though my wife's hands are quite small, I had her handle and use the camera a bit, and she said, yeah, it's big, but it feels fine. And so I think that even if you have smaller hands, it may not be your favorite camera ergonomically, but I don't think that it's going to be entirely off-putting. I would say you might be more off-put if you're looking to travel smaller and lighter. If that's the case, the Z8 is definitely not your camera. This is a camera that is really tall. That's kind of the main things that stood out to me. It is 4.7 inches tall, or 118.5 millimeters, and then it is it's fairly wide, and that's particularly true compared to Sony bodies, which frankly aren't wide enough. It's 5.7 inches wide, or 144 millimeters wide. The depth is more typical, more similar to like Canon EOS R5, and so that's less of a difference, but it's tall and it is wide. Now the body is extremely robustly made. It is a combination of a carbon fiber and then magnesium alloy blend, and so it is very tough, very durable. Nikon claims that it has similar weather sealing levels to the Z9, which is the top of the heap for their current models. I certainly can attest for the fact that I've used it in the wet a fair bit and I've had zero issues. Obviously, you're going to want to make sure that you're also using a weather sealed lens if you are doing that. Now, it's a big body, but it's not like big with a lot of empty space. I have reviewed a few medium format cameras where I felt like, why is this so big? Because there's not really a lot here in terms of control. That's not the case here. We've actually got a lot of physical controls, a variety of different custom or function buttons you can use, various controls, like for example here you have the ability to contact this and to affect what kind of autofocus mode that you are in, and so you know, it's got a lot of physical controls on the top near the shutter button. Just all around there's a lot of physical controls here, so I don't feel like it's empty space, but rather that the space is well used. And even these front function buttons, I find them reasonably easy to get to with fingertips and activate on the fly. Now, one thing that I do have to critique, and I recognize this critique is coming from outside the Nikon brand. If you've been using Nikon all along and it's the sole camera system that you use, this is not going to register with you. But if you're someone that uses multiple platforms or is coming from another platform, I do find it a bit annoying that everything rotates in the opposite direction. So even in mounting or releasing the lens or putting on a lens cap, it all works in the opposite direction. And it's not just opposite of one other brand, it's opposite of every other brand I've ever used, be that Canon, Sony, Fuji, in either APS-C or medium format, you know, Sigma's bodies like the FP, the Leica bodies, everything rotates the opposite direction. So it seems just kind of odd. And I realize they're carrying that on from what's been their tradition, but there is an actual functional issue that I run into, and that is that if a lens hood is mounted on a lens and that lens hood does not bayonet well, the problem with this motion when it comes to releasing it's also the direction that would release the lens hood. And so I find that sometimes in the process of trying to mount or remove the lens, I end up inadvertently moving the lens hood because it's moving in the same direction. And so that can be a bit of an issue because if your lens hood is off kilter, it can introduce some mechanical vignette. So I don't love that aspect, but again, I recognize that's a unique critique from someone coming from other brands. At this point, I own cameras from four other brands, I should say. And so you know, it just means that this is working opposite of all of them. And so I don't love that. Now, as we'll talk about in a moment, this camera is built around a fully electronic shutter. However, in the Z8, they did include, which I'm very happy about, a dust cover that will come down when the camera is powered off. This dust shield will help to protect the sensor, and so that means that when it'll help to prevent dust from getting to the sensor. Now the Z8, like many other high-end cameras, does have a top-mounted LCD screen, which I do appreciate. I have never stopped wondering why Sony does not include that, in that both my Alpha 1 and my A7R Mark V are my only professional level cameras that don't have a top-mounted LCD, but I certainly do appreciate it here. I will also note that that kind of plays into that, along with the rear LCD, plays into a physical control point that I don't personally necessarily love, and that is that when it comes to a lot of these functions where a button needs to be held down, be it exposure compensation, ISO, even this selector on the left side for, you know, AFC, manual focus, etc., that the process is you hold that down and then you actually rotate the rear wheel here to kind of scroll through various functions. And it only shows up in quite a small area on the LCD screen. And so ergonomically, I just feel like that could be a little bit better implemented. Obviously, as with anything, you get accustomed to it after a time, but initially it's not like I intuitively begin to handle the camera, saw that function, and immediately it made sense to me. And so that's something that I don't necessarily love. I do love, however, the fact that we have a dial that allows you to have a separate configuration for stills and video. So that includes your customization of your buttons, your custom menu, various functions like that. It's a true hybrid camera. Now the viewfinder itself has, on paper, it doesn't seem very impressive. It's only 3.69 million dots, which is out outclassed with by a number of competitors. But I will say that it's actually better in real world use than what it is on paper. It's kind of the opposite of the Sony viewfinders in that regard, which tend to have very good specs, but I just don't often love them in actual use. So in this case, I appreciate the fact that it is nice and clear. I appreciate the fact it has a good refresh rate. There's no blackout, this being a stacked sensor, no blackout in there, so it makes tracking very good. And so I would say that amongst my cameras, I would say that the R5's viewfinders may be a little bit better, but I would definitely prefer this over the real world performance of my higher rated, or higher spec, I should say, Sony cameras, probably about even with the performance of, say, my Fujifilm X-H2. So while I feel like the viewfinder is better than the specs suggest, I'm not going to say the same thing about the rear LCD screen. Now, on a positive note, the resolution is not bad, 2.1 million dots. As far as the touch responsiveness, it's quite good. I would say it's pretty near Canon, which Canon would be my favorite in that regard, and so I have no issues with it in that. I don't love, however, the fact that it doesn't have it's only a tilting and not a fully articulating, and it doesn't seem to have as much range of tilt as what some of the best tilting options do. The amount of tilt that you can get just isn't quite as good as what you can on some models, and I certainly personally prefer a fully articulating screen, though I realize, again, that's a matter of taste and not everyone feels that way. So I would say that the rear LCD is fine. It's nothing exceptional about it. Memory storage is on the right side of the camera, and we have dual card slots here. One is a CF Express Type B, which gives you your fast writing capability. That's backed up by a UHS-2 rated SD card slot. Obviously, that's going to be the slower of the two mediums, and so you might want to set up your recording accordingly if you're trying to do fast burst or do things where you're going to need to write, say, very high resolution video. You're going to want to prefer to do that to the faster CF Express Type B card, which fortunately the price on those really has come down, and so you can get big cards for a pretty reasonable amount of money at this point. So I have no issues with that. That's identical to the way that Canon handles things. Other side of the camera, you have your ports. I appreciate the fact that we have a full-size HDMI, which is great. We have both a 3.5 millimeter headphone input, or excuse me, microphone input, and then a 3.5 millimeter monitoring jack. Down at the bottom, you have something that is unique in my experience, and that is that you have dual USB-C ports. And so one is for data transfer, the other is for charging the battery within the camera. I will note on the audio front that we don't have, like Sony does, Sony has the ability to record digital audio through the hot shoe. We just have kind of the old, dumber hot shoe here, so it doesn't have any kind of digital audio recording capabilities, unfortunately. Now on the battery front, we are using a smaller battery than what is found in the Z9. This is the more typical EL15C battery, kind of the classic Nikon battery. It's rated at 2,280 mAh in this configuration, and the CEPA rating is about 340 shots, which isn't great on paper. Obviously, as with all of these CEPA battery ratings, you tend to get better performance in real life, but having a backup battery is probably a good choice because this is a fairly power-hungry camera. Finally, I'll talk about the VR here. Again, kind of like the viewfinder, this is only rated at 5 stops, which on paper is not all that great. And VR, or vibration reduction, is what Nikon refers to their in-body image stabilization system. Now, you can get up to 6 stops of the kind of combo VR sync if you're using a Nikon lens that is equipped with in-lens stabilization. They will work in harmony. However, while it's only rated at 5 stops, I have found that the system works quite a bit better in my real-world experience than what I have found with Sony. And so Sony's IBIS, in-body image stabilization, is more highly rated in terms of stops, but I actually found that the VR and the Nikon does a little bit better job. And I particularly noticed that with some third-party lenses that I've tested on both Sony and now on Nikon, I definitely preferred the stability I found with a lens like, say, the Tamron 70-300 millimeter. I preferred it on Nikon for stability than what I saw on Sony bodies. And so overall, I have no complaints about the VR. I feel like it does a good job, though as always, if you're going to be walking around, a gimbal is going to give you smoother results than any kind of in-camera stabilization. There are limits to these systems, but used within the constraints of those limits, I think that this camera does a great job. Price right now is currently at $3,800 US. Now I realize in an absolute sense, that's a lot of money. Relative to the competition, however, that falls about mid-pack, and for the value being offered here, I would say that it is a fairly competitive price and feels like it's hitting the right spot in my personal opinion. Now, as mentioned, this is a fully electronic shutter, so let's talk about the burst and the buffer potential here in that electronic shutter. So there is no mechanical shutter option here, but like a Sony Alpha 1 or Sony A9, this is designed purely around an electronic shutter. So the positive here is that we have an extremely fast readout speed. So at 1/270th of a second, that's actually slightly faster than the Alpha 1, which is 1/260th of a second, and much, much faster than, say, the Canon EOS R5, which is rated at only 1/60th of a second in terms of that readout. And so what that means is you're going to get quite low rolling shutter here. It eliminates one of the potential issues with an electronic shutter. And so this is going to be a good camera for tracking action, whether in stills or video. One of the advantages, of course, with the pure electronic shutter is you get a higher upper limit to the shutter speed that you can achieve. In this case, up to 1/32,000th of a second versus the typical 1/8,000th of a second, which is the upper limit for a mechanical shutter. So that's great. One of the potential issues with electronic shutter tends to be flash sync speed. And while this doesn't do nearly as good a job as what the Sony Alpha 1 does, at kind of the more practical level, you can get 1/320th of a second with the Alpha 1, and even as much as 1/400th of a second, though that's in a more specific configuration. Here you're going to see 1/200th as your practical limit, and again in some situations 1/250th. It's good enough to get the job mostly done, not quite as good obviously as the Alpha 1. You can always go up into HSS or high-speed sync with a little less flash output, but of course removing that shutter speed limit. Now with this electronic shutter, we can get up to 20 frames per second in full shooting RAWs, and that is with full tracking capabilities, and it works fantastic. And if you don't mind just getting a JPEG output, you can actually bump that up to 30 frames per second. You can go even beyond that to 60 and 120 frames per second, but it's severely compromised. It's at even a higher crop factor, so much smaller files, and also you are losing ongoing autofocus and even metering at that point. So I would avoid those higher limits, but it works great at even up to that 30 frames per second. Now the buffer depth is not necessarily as clearly defined as what some other brands will put out, say, in their white papers, but on a practical level, it's similar to what you get on the Z9. Your smallest raw buffer you're going to get is about 80 shots, and that's if you're shooting full lossless at 20 frames per second. Now, if you drop to 15 frames per second, that buffer dramatically increases. Also, if you shoot at higher compression modes like the high efficiency star or the high efficiency modes, you will increase that to 600 plus and even 1,000 plus frames before the buffer fills. And obviously, if you're shooting JPEGs or HEIC, you're going to get basically no practical limit to the buffer. So I haven't found the buffer to be limiting at all. I've been able to get whatever I wanted. Just know those little caveats with that. And that leads me to the discussion of the autofocus system. This autofocus system was good, and it got even better with the really important Firmware 2.0, which just increased overall performance and added things like bird eye detection, kind of a dedicated mode. It does have, by the way, the ability to have an auto selection of your subject, and I really love when cameras include that if it works, which it does here. I've been able to seamlessly switch between animal, human, bird subjects, etc., without having to worry about switching mode and getting really good consistent results. It just tracks what I want it to track. Autofocus system here has 493 that's phase detect points. This is a typical hybrid system with phase detect backed by a contrast AF system. It is the same autofocus system found in the Z9, which is Nikon's best. It provided very excellent tracking capabilities. As mentioned, there's no blackout, and even at shooting at 30 frames per second. For example, in this burst shooting with the Viltrox AF 16mm f1.8, I was able to track my son jumping, and even as I'm panning across, every one of these shots is focused correctly on the eye, even shooting at f1.8, which is fantastic. And so I'm really happy with that regard. I've actually really preferred third-party lenses on Nikon for a number of reasons. Sony these tend to be so far released on Sony FE and then on Nikon Z mount. And on Sony, you have an artificial limitation where you can only get a maximum of 1/15th, and it just seems like they don't always work quite as well. Whereas I feel like they're kind of achieving their full potential on Nikon, and so I've gotten really great results, even for shooting birding shots. You can see bird in flight here, really well focused results and without any kind of issue. I've also shot in challenging situations like, for example, a graduation ceremony where someone had the bright idea of doing under the sea and turn the lights off. And so trying to track students walking up down the aisle and achieving awards in not quite black conditions, but very, very, very dimly lit. So I was shooting consistently even at f2.8 at 12,800, and I had no autofocus issues, whether students were walking up and down the aisle or moving around and collecting rewards. And in fact, in this particular shot, where people could just stand still and pose for me, even shooting at ISO 12,800, I felt like the results really looked quite good. I've also found that I enjoy manual focus. I've already talked about liking the stabilizer here, but I also appreciate the manual focus aids that seem to work well, and I've gotten good results in that regard. I've also been experimenting with the Megadap and then also a newer adapter that allows me to use Sony FE glass adapted over to the Nikon Z mount. And so far, I'm at the early stages of that, but I've been fairly impressed. And so far, I think I've seen a better adapting result than definitely what I saw when I was adapting Canon EF mount lenses to Sony E mount. And so autofocus system seems really quite capable. On the video side of things, Video AF works well. I wouldn't say that it works as well, quite as well as what either Canon or Sony do, which they're at the top of the heap right now in my experience when it comes to autofocus during video. Now, I will say that Nikon is far superior to anything that I've seen from Fuji, and so definitely many steps above in that regard, but not quite to the level of Canon or Sony, but good enough that I have not been unhappy with any kind of results, and I certainly feel like I can rely on autofocus for the most part. On the video side of things, this again is an amazing jack of all trades camera, and that includes having a huge range of resolutions and bit rates. You can get up to 8K in 30 frames per second, and if you're shooting in their own dedicated NRAW format, which not every piece of software can decode, by the way, but if you're shooting in that and you have a way of using the footage, you can actually shoot up to 8K 60 frames per second there at that point. You can shoot 4K up to 120 frames per second. You can get 12-bit video in camera. It has things like N-Log and HLG, and they claim up to a little over 14 stops of dynamic range if you're shooting in N-Log. And so a really robust just amount of video specs and able to get really nicely detailed footage through that. I will say my only complaint when it comes to the video so far is that I do find that just right out of the box, if you're not grading the material, I find that sometimes I find magenta or skin tones to be skewed a little bit to the magenta side of things. And that's like when I'm just doing my basic kind of hand test, for example. I've reviewed tons of cameras and lenses under those lighting conditions, and I just kind of like the overall white balance, color balance that comes out of it, maybe the least out of this camera of ones that I've reviewed in the past. So that's my one complaint, but in general, I found footage to look really, really nice. So finally, let's talk about the sensor here. Now, I will do a full detailed sensor breakdown at the end if you want that, and so you can stay tuned for that at the end. This is a stacked 45.7 megapixel sensor, and it's a stacked sensor similar to what you're going to find in the Sony Alpha 1 or in the new Canon R5 Mark II. The dynamic range is rated by photons to photos at 11.32 stops, which is just a hair behind the Alpha 1. It's behind the R5 by about a half stop. Overall, I found in my test that this performed about what I would expect, able to deliver good shadow recovery at 4 to 5 stops, and then good highlight recovery through 2 stops, but starting to fall apart between 2 and 3 stops, where it's not fully recovering all of the highlights. Overall, the dynamic range is sufficient that I've been happy with it, and I don't feel like my editing process has had to change compared to the other cameras that I am regularly using. On the ISO side of things, obviously when it comes to Nikon and some of their cameras, the ISO range starts earlier. So in this case, 64 versus 100, and the upper limit is 25,600, though in both directions there are expandable modes that I largely avoid personally. I found that ISO performance is nicely clean through 3200, and it is what I would consider usable at 6400 and 12,800. In event settings where I've been forced to, I've actually relied on both of those a lot, and I've shot a lot at ISO 6400 and 12,800. Obviously, my preference is to shoot at lower ISOs, but it works well enough that I'm perfectly happy with the photos that I've gotten in those settings. You can go up, as noted, to 25,600. I would largely avoid that. The noise starts to get really rough. Your shadows are really lifting due to just being uneven pixels in there. So I would avoid that, and certainly the expanded modes. But overall, again, I feel like the ISO performance is quite good for a high resolution camera. That resolution is 8,256 by 5,504 pixels. And that's lots of resolution in most settings. Obviously, there is higher resolution available from Sony products, for example. But I would say for most people in most every situation, this is going to be plenty of resolution. Because the crop factor is 1.5 times versus the Canon R5 has a 1.6 times crop factor. Here we get a APS-C mode that's 19 megapixels. That's a very, very usable figure. In fact, my early APS-C cameras I used was Canon's T1i, which I believe was 15 or 16 megapixels. And then I used the EOS 60D, which was 18 megapixels. And so this easily bests both of those. Plenty of resolution to do lots of things with. You have three different options when it comes on how to control the resolution, not really the resolution, but really the file size when it comes to RAWs. You have your lossless, which is my preferred format. The average file size is about 60 megabytes for that. You have your high efficiency star, which are plus, maybe call it. They don't want to do plus because that's what Sony does. So high efficiency star, and that average file size, it's a little bit more compressed, so it's about 30 megabytes per image. And then your lowest is just high efficiency, and that is going to be 20 megabytes per image. Obviously, there's a law of diminishing returns. Most people in most images probably won't be able to notice much of a difference, but if you're really pixel peeping, you will notice a little bit of difference between those formats. With the color science here, I find that it is good, but I wouldn't put it as high in my ranking as either Canon or Fuji. I'd put it about on par for me with Sony. The truth of the matter is with the current generation of these cameras, the difference is very marginal. I just very slightly prefer the colors from either Fuji or Canon, but it's not by any kind of significant margin at all, and it's easy enough to edit to get a similar kind of color. There are a wide variety of different color looks in camera that you can choose from. But again, I would say that Fuji still got the edge with their film simulations, just something that they do really, really well. But I do enjoy some of the various looks that are in camera, and there's a few that have become go-tos that I reach for when I am processing myself. If you want more on the sensor, stay tuned at the end. My conclusion, however, is this. After over 6 months of use, I have no regrets about purchasing and using the Nikon Z8. Particularly when it comes to using third-party lenses, I actually have found that this is my preferred camera for using third-party lenses if I have the option. Like some of my other very favorite cameras, this is a very versatile jack of all trades camera. But while it may not be master of none, it is pretty close to being master of all. It does pretty much everything very, very well. And what I find with these cameras at this point, there's some minor give and take in different areas to different brands, but there's a whole lot of parity here in overall performance. Overall, I really love the camera. I look forward to many years of using it in the future and doing a lot of lens reviews on it. Now, if you happen to want even more information after all of that, you have some options. You can access my full text review that is linked in the description down below. There's also links there to an image gallery if you want to see some photos that I've taken with a variety of lenses. There are some buying links there. Always, if you can use those, it helps to support this channel, so thanks for that. And of course, if you want even more information on the sensor performance, stay tuned with me right now. We're going to dive into that together.
Okay, we'll start by taking a look at the ISO performance. So here is our base ISO. Here we'll take a quick peek around. You can see that everything is nice and clean in the shadow areas. You can see here that blacks are nice and inky. There's no striations in anything here. Overall white balance, everything looks good. Take a look at the swatches back here. You can see that there's no visible noise. So all the things we would expect at base ISO, which is 64 here. So by ISO 800, we'd expect that things are remaining really nice and clean, and we can see that is the case. You can see just the finest beginning of some pattern noise there in some of those color swatches. Not a whole lot to see. Everything here as far as the shadows, they still look nice and inky. No real issues there. By ISO 1600, you can see just a little bit more pattern noise, but that's basically it. Nothing else is going on here. Everything else looks clean. By 3200, that noise is a little bit more visible at a pixel level. Probably the first level you're really going to notice it in any kind of significant way. You can see that now in the shadows, there is just the beginnings of some inconsistently lit pixels there. So just a little bit of that noise that's affecting that, starting to lift that shadow area. Now by ISO 6400, that is going to become more prominent, as you can see here. You're definitely going to start to really notice the noise in different areas, but it does kind of depend on what you're looking at. Here, yes, there's that kind of fine grain, but it doesn't look bad. We can see that overall the textures are still good. There's lots of information there. Some noise here on the mirror, but no color shifting. Nothing too negative. It's mostly in the shadow area where I find that the shadows are starting to lift. But if we pop back out for a moment and we look at it at a global level, I don't know that you'd really notice much of a difference. Now at 12,800, the shadows you can tell are not quite as inky, but again, not terrible yet. I would still categorize this as probably usable. You can see if we look up here at the swatches, yes, that noise is very visible, but if you put a little bit more natural texture onto it, like the SLR here, you can see the noise, but it isn't destructive. And again, there's no color shift, which is a big deal to me. Detail still looks quite good. If you look like at the lever here, there's still a lot of information there. So nothing really tremendous to complain about. By 25,600, however, my opinion has changed, and now everything is rough enough that it's definitely starting to just kind of impact the image in a negative fashion. And so now I find that there's just a little bit less detail and information. Again, I do give it praise that the colors are still pretty consistent, but the noise is rough. And if you look out into what should be a consistently black background, there's just a lot of those brighter pixels, kind of like a snow that's everywhere. And you can see a bit of a pattern that is there. And I'll show you a real world image in a moment that will just show that a bit more. Now, 25,600 is the upper natural limit. If you push past that into the expanded zone here at like 51,200, you can see even looking at the image globally that everything has been negatively impacted. Colors are still pretty good. I'm going to give it credit on that front, but we can see that the noise pattern has just gotten much rougher, and you can see that there's a lot of just kind of patterning that's in the shadow area. You're definitely going to see that in certain circumstances. So here's a real world shot at ISO 6400. And so you can see if you're looking at the subject, really not bad at all. But here in the areas that should be uniform, you can definitely see that there is some pattern that is there, and kind of like this circular pattern that's taking place, swirling in the background. And so it's not even as it should be. This is 12,800 here, and so it's under really poor lighting conditions. But you can see that despite that, it's not terrible. Like, there's still a decent amount of detail there, probably with a little bit of playing with the, white balance to try to get skin tones a little bit better. This is, usable. And again, the pattern is there in the background, but because there's more kind of natural texture there, you don't see it as much. And so it really is going to be situational as to how usable images are at high ISO levels. But I wouldn't hesitate, and I haven't hesitated, to shoot up to 12,800 in event type settings like this. So let's shift gears for a moment and let's talk about color and then also overall detail and resolution. So you can see from this shot, even with a fairly inexpensive lens, that we've got nice detail. Skin tones here look quite good. I think that every now and then magentas are just a little bit more saturated than what I would like, but overall skin tones look good. You can see here in terms of just the variety of colors that it's able to just capture a nice range of colors, and it looks really excellent, appetizing here. Here's another portrait type shot, and so this is with the Tamron 35 to 150. You can see it's capable of producing really, really beautiful detail. So I don't have any issues with resolution or the ability to sharpen files on the Z8. I feel like all of that is fairly easily handled, and I like the amount of detail that I'm able to produce here. And again, I think that skin tones in this shot look just fine. Here's another shot that just shows nicely rich color. Again, I've been able to get lots of images that I really, really like. Detail is very, very good here. And so as far as some of those other peripheral things, again, as I mentioned earlier, I slightly prefer the color science from Fuji and Canon, but it's not by any kind of significant margin. I'm able to get lots of images that I'm perfectly happy with the Z8. Here's another landscape type image, and again, you can see great detail, so again, no problem. You would have the ability to deeply crop this image and still be very usable. I've got the canoer headed out here, and so, I mean, I could create a new shot with a framing that's somewhat similar to this, and it would still be perfectly usable for sharing pretty much anywhere. And so I think for most people, resolution is sufficient, as is the quality of the color and images you can get in general. So let's go back into the lab and let's talk about dynamic range here for a moment. So once again, our goal is to be able to kind of recreate this even when we either overexpose or underexpose an image. So we'll start with underexposure. So here we have all the way to 4 stops of underexposure. So you can see that there's lots of information that is severely crushed here. And you can see that I've added those 4 stops back in post here. So attempt to recover shadows and try to get that image back up to baseline. So if the image on the left represents our baseline, we can see that for the most part we have achieved that. The white balance is not identical metering, and so the effect of the white balance is very, very slightly different here, though in some ways, the slightly cooler white balance here, I think is actually maybe a bit more accurate. But nonetheless, we can see that as far as the brightness and the recover of the overall contrast, nothing to complain about there. Now, if we punch in and we look at a pixel level, we can see that in this zone through here, I would say that yes, there's a little bit more noise, a little bit maybe extra of color striations. So color is not completely accurate in this black area. I think that there's a tiny bit of patterning that is there. But overall, in general, I would say that we were able to recover lots of information without any kind of major penalty. And when you looked at how far we were crushed before, as I kind of scroll throughout this image, overall, I would say I'm perfectly satisfied with the shadow recovery and the end result that I was able to get. Once again, as with most of these cameras, the struggle comes more in areas that should be uniform, where you can see issues more. But on this side, I mean, I can very, very faintly tell that it's there, but overall, it looks really quite good. So shadow recovery is a definite strength here. Now, highlight recovery tends to be an area where modern cameras aren't quite as successful as they are in recovering shadows. So you can see here with the 2 stops of overexposure, you can see that we've started to lose color out of the swatches up here, some inconsistent coloration in the timer face there. Then you'll see in the face of the SLR here that there are areas that are just textures lost due to blown out hot spots. And so the goal is to be able to recover those successfully. And so here on the right side, we've seen I've dialed back the exposure by 2 stops, and you can see that we're at this stage, I would say that we're almost completely successful. We've got the texture back. We can see here that in the areas where colors were starting to be lost, that those colors are coming back and the saturation level looks natural on them. Overall here in the timer face, it's very consistent once again, and so no issues there. We can see, however, that at 3 stops of overexposure, we're starting to see some issues. Now you can see that's severely overexposed, but a few things that we can see. First of all, you can see that on the right side, we really weren't able to get all of those textures back on the face of the SLR, and here some of that texture information has been lost. In the color swatches, colors actually are handled fairly well here, but you're going to see in areas that are just kind of a little bit shadowed near the edge, you can see that there's a little bit more color consistency there, a little bit deeper saturation than what there is in the center of the box. And we can definitely see here over on the timer face, you can determine a difference between what was slightly in shadow and then what was kind of fully exposed, because you can see that there's a color variance that is there now. If I put this next to the two-stop recovery, you can really see what I'm talking about, in that you can see that that information is just kind of washed out, and so the image isn't quite right by comparison. And even when it comes to the saturation, say with the yellow here, it's a little bit dull by comparison. Reds, these other colors, there's just been some things that have been lost there that haven't been able to be recovered at nearly 3 stops. At the same time, this is far from the worst that I've seen. And yes, there are still some blown out hot spots, but the image hasn't completely gone to pieces. At 4 stops of overexposure, however, it has gone to pieces. And you can see that this recovery, you wouldn't even be able to sell that as being natural at all. It just looks like it's been destroyed. And in fact, it has. So somewhere between 2 and 3 stops is the limit. Whereas I would say with shadow recovery, you can go pretty close to 5 stops and still have a very successful outcome. Overall, this is a very competitive sensor, not class leading in any area, I wouldn't say, but at the same time, it is a very good sensor that can produce beautiful images and produce them at a very fast rate.
So I hope you enjoyed this exhaustive look at the Nikon Z8 and a long-term review with Firmware 2.0. As always, thanks for watching, have a great day, and let the light in.